called in the little caravan out there. Have you ever seen that?
No.
It's
Where is that?
it's just south of Sutherland. There's a little caravan that he's made a makeshift cabin in there. It's quite amusing.
That must be something new, though.
Relatively, I think it's been there 3 or 4 years. And that's,
Yeah.
That's something quite unusual. Some of those characters you've eaten the birds. Alan, I thought you were going to miss class today. I was going to that mark against you. I know, it was hip punch. It's hectic today, isn't it? Where's our doctor?
He's collecting his far from the receiving service. He will be here.
He's on his way. Okay.
Previous night, I collected him, but he's for service.
5 o'clock anyway. I think they're a bit quick. I've got 5 o'clock. Have you?
It's 5 again.
5 dead. So they're slightly. I'll remember that. There's a few students that succumb to that as well. Hello. No, we're that small, I'll wait for you, don't worry about that. It reminds me of a joke I used to like about a football team that was struggling. The supporter phones up and says, "What time's kick-off?" And the guy says, "What time can you make it?" Hello. I'm glad you made it. I've done my homework for you. It would have been a wasted bit of brain matter. Well, it's just that clock's a little bit early, so we will kick off. It's like 5 minutes early. It's just on 5, so I'm sure everyone will enjoy this. And as I said, we're becoming a daily thing. I've done my homework for you. Just with the use of the online internet. The question was yesterday. We talked about obviously the spread of sport around the world, and I guess this was going to come up. Someone was going to give me a couple of countries I hadn't covered. But actually, the two that you asked me about, Japan and France, fit in perfectly with what I was talking about yesterday. Thank goodness. They kind of proved the theory I was talking about. We'll start with Japan. According to sources on the internet, I did check a few, and they seem to be consistent, including the RFU Museum at Twickenham. Rugby, it was recognised that rugby was in Japan as early as 1870. And to my delight, would you believe that the people credited with taking rugby to Japan was the British military, with some old boys from rugby school being the first recorded players or people to bear, would you believe? So that fits in with this idea of the public school. And then, to my delight, the pattern just, remember the 4 stages of diffusion we talked about? It almost fitted perfectly. The Japanese royal family took hold of the game of rugby and really enjoyed it, because apparently it was very similar to a traditional Japanese game that was played. The cross between football and rugby, they played anyway, so they took to this game. And then the really took hold in the city of Yokohama at the university there. So that's the hotbed. So there's your education, your military, etc. And according to the latest stats, Japan has the 4th highest population of rugby players, 130,000 players. So that's why, believe it or not, they've got the World Cup. It is a more popular sport than we probably give them credit for. And it's got that heritage, 1870. France, well, that was down to the Brits as well. More of a general reason, it was British businessmen apparently. They played at a club in Le Havre. That was the first recorded, just across the channel, of course, first recorded club. And then it spread to Paris, no doubt part of the business scene. And then from there it went down to the southwest, which is a hotbed. So it was British trade and business over in France around the same time, 1870, as it spread to Japan. So that proves my point about it being an expanding game around that time. So hopefully that's covered the homework. I'm sure something else will come up. Yes.
Maybe a few specific information.
Please.
I don't know, I really don't know the link with rugby at all. But apparently Japan's embassy, well, they celebrated, last year they celebrated 100 years of the embassy in South Africa. And apparently we're the 2nd oldest
they're quite big on cheese.
They are. The brave blossoms, they're called. Anyway, today we're going to turn our attention closer to home. We're going to look at South Africa. We've talked about, on Monday we looked at the evolution of sport and rugby, how it fitted in, and yesterday we looked at the global game, and how it's played around the world. So we're going to bring it closer to home for the next few days, with reference, of course, to what we've already covered. So we're going to look at rugby, I'll put it rugby and race, of course, because any kind of social investigation of sport in this country, not just rugby, and I'll make that clear, this rugby is not distinct when it comes to the race issue. Involves looking at certain aspects of race as well in terms of sport. So to start off with, I came across this, which is quite a statement. You have to live in South Africa to understand how people respond to rugby. Now, I can agree with that. As I said to you before, right at the start, I moved to South Africa in the mid-90s. I studied at Stellenbosch, and that was what struck me. I remember that it was the time of the house games. So you had, Helderberg playing House Murray and all this, and the passion that these lads had for rugby, I was just in awe of. I mean, up to that point, I was a bit naive. I thought, well, it's very much an English or British game, and other parts of the world play it, but they've instilled some kind of passion. And I think that probably sums up some of the ways I can defend South Africa at academic conferences, and I try to explain to my learning colleagues, not just here in South Africa, I'm not saying I'm an expert, but I believe you have to immerse yourself in a culture to even comment or observe. And a lot of people write about South Africa without having even been here. I remember a colleague of mine at Ulster University, and he wrote about the game, the football, soccer in Africa. And would you believe he never set foot on the continent of Africa? And it was a wonderful book in terms of academic, research, etc. And to his credit, he was quite a stubborn guy. To his credit, once he visited Ghana and visited the soccer African Cup of Nations, he realised that actually this story was far more complex. So I like to think all that time I spent watching rugby, sometimes in bars, listening to rugby stories, and just basically absorbing the culture of rugby in this country has led to a little bit of an understanding where I can comment on it. Today, of course, my problem is that I'm going to get through a lot of dates and a lot of history in barely an hour, and that's the challenge, of course, of doing something like this. So please forgive me if it feels like I'm just brushing over the top. But hopefully I'm going to touch the main things. So today, I'm going to look at what this game means in this country. Well, according to World Rugby, and this is a stat you can take with a pinch of salt, but this came off the internet. Would you believe I mentioned that Japan has 130,000 registered players? The recent figures suggest that nearly 500,000 registered players are here in South Africa, which may not or may sound significant, but I think it just shows you the scale of that. It shows what an important game it is. That's registered players. We're not talking about supporters or people who take a little interest in the game. It's broken down, thanks to World Rugby. How they get these stats, I'm not too sure, but it breaks it down into obviously age groups. I'm interested in this though. Out of that 434,000, only 10,000 are female. Now that stat is something we could talk about as well in terms of the makeup of South African society. That stat would certainly be a lot more in Britain. I mean, I can probably go and find you those stats tomorrow, but it certainly will be. And that's one thing that struck me when I was here in South Africa. Of course, rugby is traditionally a man's game, a masculine game, but even I would go as far as saying that South Africa is probably 10, 20 years behind when it comes to equality in the game of rugby. Certainly, it's been elevated in the United Kingdom, women's rugby. So that stat doesn't surprise me. Now, of course, another important stat is how many referees we've got, because rugby is always played with a referee. I mean, you have your informal games, but, as we were talking about earlier, the most important person on that pitch, when two groups were coming together for the first time, was the referee. And rugby, with its rules, constitutes a game that the most important figure, arguably, on the pitch at any one time is the referee, and the way the players relate to that individual makes up the character of the game. So those stats are something, as I said, I was doing a little look around, and I thought, well, it's interesting. But for me, it's the percentage of female players in South Africa, which is relatively low compared to, say, the United Kingdom. So what are we going to do today? Well, we're going to look at a brief history of how modern sport arrived in South Africa, but we're going to certainly get on to rugby. As I mentioned yesterday, rugby was a product of the British Empire, and here in South Africa, that was exactly the case. We're going to look at issues of race. Now, it's something we can't avoid. My expertise comes prior to the apartheid era, but even when I was looking at the Anglo-Boer, I wasn't looking at relationship between black and white, I was looking at relationship between the two white races. So even an element of race or racism came into my studies then. So we're going to look at that era as well. And then perhaps at the end, and with your help as well, I want to hear your views of where you think South Africa is today in terms of its rugby. Now, when I talk about rugby, obviously I'm going to use examples often from the top, from the Springboks and the higher profile, but we know that rugby is played at all levels in this country, and that should not be forgotten. So let's start off. First of all, let's summarise what we've done before. South African sport, number one, well, it's whether you like the Poms or not, they brought sport to this country, the sports we're talking about, certainly rugby. And it was during the mid to late 1800s, as in Japan, as in France, rugby arrived here at almost the same time in the 1860s. We know that cricket, the two games of empire, as I've mentioned, of cricket and rugby, we know cricket was introduced, there you are. We talked about soldiers being important in this process. The British garrison. As soon as the Brits took over the Cape in the early 1800s, in fact 1802 is the first recorded date of a cricket game being played at the castle between regiments of the British Army garrison there. Rugby was introduced a little bit later, but introduced by a chap called Canon George Ogilvie, who was an educator, but obviously a man of the cloth from Winchester College. Now, just after rugby was introducing it, Winchester was playing their own form. So perhaps we'd all be talking about a course called Winchester. You know, go on the try line, the history of Winchester. Remember, it's only the place name that gave it the name, which is, I think, is quite, it's how history changes. So there was a Winchester game as well as a rugby game being played at the time. And Canon George Ogilvie would have favoured the Winchester game as he introduced it here in South Africa. We know that the public schools, by now, were getting established, certainly here in the Cape, part of the mother city, of course, and this idea of muscular Christianity was introduced here, and it fitted perfectly to the young men here on the frontier. Not only those serving the empire, but those who were, we say, more indigenous to the country, and we will talk about the Afrikaners as we go on. But they also brought into the muscular Christianity the aspect that this was a virtuous game. Yes, it was more. It may have appeared like a hooligan's game, but it was played in a certain way. And secondly, of course, this was important, that early tours and this idea of building up an imperial brotherhood. If you toured together, if you played together, you traded together, and you fought. More importantly, you fought together. So these early tours were also tied up around, and I'll talk about that now as I go on, were tied up in this idea of this creating this empire brotherhood wherever it was. And here in South Africa, that was certainly the case. Now, the first international sports tour, when I gave my talk about Mikey Fontaine in the book, I asked the audience, when do you think the first ever international sports tour took place? And often people will guess long before that. But you know the first international team only arrived here in 1889, and it was a cricket team. It wasn't a rugby team, it was a cricket team. It was the English team of the day. Major Walton's English cricket team came down, and it made the news. Now, just to put that in context, later in 1891, 95 and 99, Lord Hawke, the English cricket captain, brought down his team. But where my studies come in, there's a link, you see. The English don't just send their sports teams around the world willy-nilly. There's generally an advantage to doing so. Why do you think South Africa suddenly became the focus of the British Empire at this time? Diamonds. Diamonds had been discovered. All of a sudden, it wasn't that outpost, so now we need to bring this place into the fold. It was a very, very important part of the British Empire. So to cement that relationship, all of a sudden, the focus became on sending sports teams down here. Just to put it in context, the English were sending cricket teams to Philadelphia in North America long before they came here. So it wasn't a case of let's spread this message of sport. That was incidental. It was let's cement this idea of empire at a time when South Africa suddenly became important. And that's what the focus of my book is. That a young Scotsman arrives, James Logan, who created Mikey's Fontaine, but not only that, he was a working class guy, and within 4 years of arrival he was a millionaire and he built his own town. That's what diamonds and gold will do for you at that time, arriving at the right time. And of course he built his reputation on the back of bringing sport here, one of the benefactors. Now this is the first ever international team. I mean, it doesn't look like Johnny Wilkinson and the boys, does it? I mean, this was Major Walton's team. I mean, look at them. You talk about bringing a sense of civility. I mean, the gentlemen and players, and what I like, of course, about cricket more than anything, is that class system is entrenched. When I talk about gentlemen and players, you know, even in the team lineup, you can't read it here, but some of these are just given surnames, others are given titles and initials. That differentiates the class of this team. You had generally the professional, the lower class, who was the hard-working bowler, and of course the star batsman was your gentleman, captain, often a lord, who could very good at those after-dinner speeches. So even sport at that time was stratified in a way that we probably don't appreciate today. Do you know it was only in the 1960s when the changing rooms at the Oval were actually joined together? I mean, the team would actually, there was 2 separate changing rooms up to that point. I mean, cricket's incredible for supporting this idea of hierarchy. So that's why I'm fascinated by that game. Well, a few years later, there he is, there's James Logan, by the way, that's the man who created Mikey's Fontaine. We were just talking, he was also involved in rugby, he appreciated rugby, but as a Scotsman, which was unusual, he put his money and effort into cricket, because whether you like cricket or not, at the end of the 1800s, it was the empire game, it was the #1 sport. There was a chap called W.G. Grace knocking around, and he was the sporting superstar of his day. He was your Lionel Messi, David Beckham, everybody had heard of him, or Usain Bolt. Do you know Usain Bolt's in town on Saturday? He's coming to the Met. Isn't that interesting? Yeah. So maybe racing, you never know. I just heard it on the radio, yeah. So someone important's in town. But this was James Logan, this was Lord Hawke, and this was your English cricket team. A team of gentlemen who had spread this idea of civility. And rugby was soon going to do that as well. So the second part of South African sport, if you can sum it up, is the legacy of the British Empire, but also its nationalism. It's always like elsewhere, it's linked to national identity, and we've talked about this. Cricket, as we'll see in the next few days, was largely rejected by the Afrikaners following the South African War, and because it was distinctively English. It was distinctively English, had this ethos about it. As we probably know, rugby was adopted as their own game, and we'll look at that in more detail tomorrow. Football, soccer was less symbolic. As it is today, it's popular with the wider population because it had less of a political or empire link to it. We know that Afrikaners remained hostile to British sport until after 1960, when South Africa became a republic. Many people still say when an Afrikaans and an English school play each other, it's the South African War all over again. And it's that kind of thing we're going to talk about tomorrow. So this subtle kind of division, sport unites, but it also can divide and it also creates some kind of national identity. Rugby, more than any other sport, I think reflected that tensions for various reasons that we're going into this week, beyond the try-line. So where did it all start? Well, it started with this man. This is the Reverend Canon George Ogilvie. Doesn't look much of a rugby player there, but he is still credited with introducing rugby to bishops here in Cape Town. So he came from Winchester College, as I said. He would have learned the Winchester rules of the game, but by the time 1861 came around, the rules from rugby school were dominant. So people were now playing a formalised version of this game, and it was termed rugby. And of course, the rules had been put together by those students in 1845, and now this agreed form of this running game was now being taken around the world. But this man symbolises everything we've talked about. He's an educator and he's a man of the cloth, and he originates from a public school in England, so he really does fit our model with buying into the rugby ethos. The first recorded match, and everybody's got their say on this, but we'll agree on this one, that one of the first recorded matches certainly that was acknowledged, and again, have a look who was playing. Officers of the army versus gentlemen of the civil service. Doesn't that just tick my box as well? So they're your two important agents of this game, and they were defined in the first game that was played just down the road here at Greenpoint in 1862. So let's think about that. they're playing here barely 10 years after these rules clubs were being formed in the United Kingdom. So it just shows how quickly this sporting revolution was spreading. It's culture. This is long before people could look up things on the TV or the internet. This was being brought physically by people from the old country into South Africa. In 1875, the Hamilton Rugby Club was formed in Seapoint, so a significant date, because one of the rugby clubs that are still around today was starting to be formed. For that to happen, of course, they had to have competition, so other clubs would have been formed around that time. This man is significant, I think, in the wider South African sporting revolution. His name is William Milton. He's an ex-England rugby international, and he arrives in Cape Town in 1878. And he's very, very keen to promote this sporting ethos from the United Kingdom. And in fact, he appears in the book, because he then eventually goes up, and I see our man from Rhodesia is not here today, but he goes up to Rhodesia, now Zimbabwe, and he takes cricket with him. So he's very good in promoting this sporting revolution wherever he goes. So that is William Milton. As I said, I'm just trying to pick out kind of key dates that will give you an idea of where we are. In 1883, Stellenbosch, the hotbed of rugby, perhaps, the hotbed of rugby in South Africa, the heart of rugby. Well, NUCT, I don't know if I can say that. But Stellenbosch Rugby Football Club was formed, as was Western Province Rugby Football Union. So the first rugby union was here. So the mother city is basically the birth of the game in South Africa as well. Now we're going to start talking about the racial aspect of the game. Well, the formation of the Western Province Coloured Rugby Football Union in 1886. So this game was always played by all population groups in this country. Let's be clear on that. White groups. Let's be clear on that. So only a few years after the game was introduced, the formal organisation of the game. But if you notice, the fact that there is a coloured union themselves would suggest that sport and race certainly predated apartheid, which it did. We know that Cecil Rhodes, James Logan were picking teams based on not ability but on colour. That's been proven. In 1886, the various regions around the country, of course, I'm calling it a country, let's be clear, South Africa didn't exist. It was a group of colonies and the Afrikaner republics to the north. But if we can still refer to it as South Africa for the ease of this lecture, Griqualand West, Eastern Province and the Transvaal followed shortly. So rugby football unions were now in these regions. Early records of African rugby. The Union Rugby Football Club was founded in PE. So not only the coloured population here in the Cape, African rugby was flourishing throughout the country as well, as early as our white unions were being formed. The South African Rugby Football Board, which is SAFU, which is what basically is the administration of the game, was founded in 1889. It's a key date in South African rugby history for various reasons. Now you'll notice where it was founded. Why has Kimberley suddenly become the focus? Well, diamonds. Cape Town is the place where people arrive to get to the diamond fields. It was the same with my man. He had to build a railway to get into the interior. So 1889, Kimberley was the hotbed in this country because that's where the wealth was created. Johannesburg was still a distant, still a glint in the eye in the future. It was Kimberley where this first rugby board, SAFU, was founded. And the first national tournament was played. It wasn't called the Curry Cup, but it was the first national tournament in 1889. Then we see this, the first British tour to South Africa. So do you remember what we were talking about yesterday in terms of, or I think it was on Monday, how first of all it was a local organisation, then regional, then national. Rugby fits that pattern perfectly in this country. The British sent their team down in 1891. It was under a captaincy of a chap called W.E. McLaren. He brought that team down and did quite well. This was still the teacher-pupil relationship. Okay? This was a team made up of all the nations. It was a British Lions tour, we compare it with today. It was financed by Cecil Rhodes. Now, Cecil Rhodes is a character who, as I said, you could spend a lifetime researching. But what I will tell you about Cecil Rhodes, he was very much invested in sport as well. He wasn't the most sporting individual. Okay, he did play cricket in Bishop Stortford in native England, of course. but he understood the power of sport. So wherever sport or a new sport was taking off, he was there to back it, along with the likes of William Milton, should I say, and James Logan. James Logan was slightly more selfish. He could see how it would promote himself, but Rhodes understood that sport at this stage had a big part in creating this idea of imperial brotherhood. So he financed the first team that came down, and here they are. W. McLaren, here he is with a wonderful moustache. The British Lions to South Africa in 1891. And it was seen as this fledgling tour. Not only are we going to cement relationships with South Africa, it's going to show the importance of this part of the world to certainly the sporting nations around the world. The Australians and the New Zealanders would have looked at this and said, now South Africa are part of our imperial brotherhood. And I said, this team, unlike future British teams that came down, found it quite easy. They taught the locals a lesson, but the reaction was interesting. When I talk about locals, who are they playing? They're playing colonial teams. They're playing Englishmen and Welshmen who came down here to obviously work in the diamond field. So a lot who actually played each other back in the United Kingdom. But they were playing teams from the Cape, teams from the diamond fields, and eventually South Africa. So, in 1892, this important thing happened. The inaugural Currie Cup was played. Western Province were the winners. Now, the Currie Cup, I'm sure you know, was donated by a chap called Sir Donald Currie. Sir Donald Currie was another Scottish industrialist who owned the Castle shipping line that was the most important link between the mother country and here in the Cape. The steamers used to go backwards and forwards. He was also an industrialist who knew the power of sport and how it was good for image, how it was good for business. Perhaps an early example of sport and marketing. He donated the Currie Cup that was going to go on and become very famous in folklore. My man James Logan at Michaelsfontein wanted a piece of the pie, and of course he donates the Logan Cup that they still play for today up in Rhodesia or Zimbabwe. Rhodesia as it was at the time. So these benefactors, these industrialists, were very good at giving money at sport, at giving money to sport and adding their name to it. In 1896, the second British tour came down under the captaincy of Johnny Hammond. But have a look at that. South Africa win their first test. 5-0 at Cape Town. Boy, that was a nail-biter. I mean, 5-0. I mean, the scores are quite interesting. They're quite low in those days. The scoring system was slightly different. But that was important. Do you remember I said the last stage in this diffusion was testing yourself against the mother country, beating the mother country. And that's what they've done for the first time in a relatively short period. So now they were established, or South Africa was established as a rugby-playing nation. But in 1897, we can see that the structure of other population groups or other ethnic groups was about getting their own organisation. The South Africa Coloured Rugby Board was formed. Western Province win the Rhodes Cup in 1898. This was a coloured team representing the Western Province. If you notice, Rhodes, which is interesting, Rhodes dedicates a cup in his own name to the coloured players here of the Cape. So there's an element of acknowledgement that this game is universal, but it's only played in certain groups, which is interesting. It's kept separate from the start. That's not to say that it wasn't played in large numbers beyond the white population. That's significant, of course. In our history, 1899 to 1902, the South African War. And like rugby did in the rest of the empire, when war was played, rugby stopped. The other sports, not necessarily. Of course, informal games were played, and the military would have played rugby, but any kind of formal competition stopped. Because rugby is that honourable game where you put down the ball and you take up a rifle, and that's what happened down here in South Africa. However, the war eventually, of course, came to an end, and we'll look at more about the war in the next few days. But in 1903, and I'm interested in this particular tour because it's often overlooked, 1903, barely a year after the end of hostilities, the third British tour came down under the captaincy of a man called Mark Morrison. Now let's have a look at the win record here. Now this is the total games played, so this would not just be against the mighty South Africa, this would be against local, provincial and town teams. They play 22, they win 11, lose 8 and draw 3. So now the balance is certainly being addressed. We can see that these touring teams are not getting it their own way. Here's Mark Morrison. Here, rather good-looking chap right in the centre, wearing his, I think his Cambridge Blues there, or his cap there, or his England cap. But this is the team now pictured in the final test at Newlands in 1903. At Newlands, in South Africa, where barely a year before the country was ravaged by war. So what the British do, you see, is send sport down to almost placate the country, to almost soothe the wounds caused by this war and division. But this team would have played mainly colonials. This idea that South Africa could be united through sport was a few years away. It was still too delicate. But this team and the football team, the Corinthians who came down, the soccer team, and the next cricket team, they would have done their bit. They would have done their bit for diplomacy. They would have toured battlefields and almost visited, almost as diplomats, acknowledged what had happened, but on the sports field everything is okay. Now another important bit of folklore, but an important part of 1903 was this. We'll talk about the origins of the green jersey. It actually happened during this tour. Now you'll notice my colour scheme for this PowerPoint, hopefully you'll appreciate that. And this is where it all happened, because Barry Heatley was the South African captain in that third test at Newlands. And what I like about it, of course, it was almost ad hoc how he did adopt the green jerseys. But he said at the time I had on hand a supply of dark green jerseys, the colours of the defunct Old Diocese Club. It was decided to wear those jerseys at Newlands, and ever since, South African 15s have been clad in green. So the folklore behind the jersey is quite interesting. So you could have been playing in any colour here in South Africa, but that's the chosen colour, of course. It's such an important part of our identity here. 1906 is an important year, and we'll talk about them tomorrow. 1906 was when South African rugby or identity really became entrenched, because that was the year when the cycle was completed. South Africa sent its first team back to the old country. It's all very well beating a British team in your own backyard, but what if you go back to the mother country and do it? And that's what happened in 1906. The first ever Springboks, and that's where the term Springbok was coined, with Paul Russ and his team arrived in England without an identity. Quickly, the British press were keen for them to have a name. They chose the Springbok. They played 28, they won 25, they lost 2 and drew 1. How about that for an advance in rugby in a matter of years? Like the New Zealand All Blacks that we mentioned earlier in 1905, they taught the Brits a lesson in their own game, in their own backyard. We're going to look at this as a tour of reconciliation more on Friday, more in detail. But I just want you to familiarise yourself with these important names in South African history. Here are the 1906 Springboks, and that is none other than Paul Russ, who was the captain, the iconic Afrikaner teacher. Very good at the after-dinner speeches. He was a very diplomatic man. He understood the meaning of this tour. How this tour, the quote says, had done more to unite this country than years of diplomacy. And we'll look at that, as I said, in the next few days. There was a mix for the first time, a mix of English-speaking South Africans, colonials, and Afrikaners. It was representative of South Africa for the first time, the whole of South Africa. But one group is missing, as you can see. It was representative just of white South Africa. So at this stage, while the majority of people in this country were non-white and were playing the game of rugby, they were not representing or being representative of the country. So this is where, while it was still termed a tour of reconciliation, it was certainly a reconciliation between the two white races. So what happens next? 1906, the dust of the South African War settles. People like Jan Smuts are trying their best to placate the country. 1910, we had the Union of South Africa, where a lot of the future was going to be rewritten, where the British, as much as the Afrikaners, have as much say into the rights of the wider population. 1914, the First World War changes the whole dynamic of the world, perhaps, forever. So we look at rugby and race where it fits in. I'm going to jump ahead a little, and I'm going to go following the First World War. And we start seeing how this game rugby was really entrenched into this question about racial representation in South Africa. Because in 1919 now, the Australians and the New Zealanders were visiting South Africa. So it wasn't just Britain playing her colonies, the colonies were playing each other. That's how well the British entrenched this sport. So now the rivalry came between Australia, New Zealand, India, South Africa. They were playing sport amongst themselves. We look at one of the first tours in 1919. The South African Rugby Football Board stipulated that no players with Maori blood should be included in that side. early as 1919. This is pre-apartheid. This is pre-National Party 1948. So this is something which often historians start at 48 and look forward. You've got to go back to these kind of incidents. In fact, an all-black of West Indian extraction, a guy called Ramsay Wilson, was sent home as a result. And you can imagine the tension this was building up now between not only back home in the mother country, but also with New Zealand. This was kind of awkward, but it was accepted. The tour went ahead without any Maori players or coloured players. In 1928, New Zealand again tour South Africa in a drawn series, interesting enough. So the two sides are now powerhouses. They've gone back to Britain, they've taught the Brits a lesson, and now really they can see they are the main rivals, certainly on the rugby pitch. A bit like today, of course. Once again, the Maoris were left behind. In fact, they were left behind again in 1949 and 1960. We can see that objections, even back then, were starting to grow. This didn't sit very easily with the New Zealanders. They accepted the fact that that's how it was. It was part of South Africa's kind of say-so, and they respected them on the rugby pitch, but it didn't sit well with them. And later, it was that kind of tension was beginning to grow. In 1935, the South African Bantu Rugby Board was founded. So here we see rugby again being divided along colour lines. So if you couldn't play with the main group, you created your own administration, and that's what the different ethnic groups were doing. Interestingly enough, the South African Coloured Rugby Board chose a team to go on an internal tour during this time. They played 9 and won 7. They called themselves the Springboks with green and gold jerseys. So instead of going against the establishment, they were saying, well, we're part of it. We're South African. We're going to wear the same jerseys with the same nickname. In fact, the blazer badge carried a leaping springbok with the words, the first national team in 1939, which is interesting because they're now embracing the symbolism, but they're saying, well, actually, we're representative of the wider population. They were actually going to send a team abroad, but World War II came about. So perhaps that would have changed the dynamics of South African rugby slightly. But war, of course, came in 1939 and changed a lot of things. Then, 1948, post-Second World War, the politics of South Africa was certainly changed by the war. The tension created between English and Afrikaans speakers, the loyalty, which side they were going to represent in that war, led to increased Afrikaner nationalism, which we're going to talk about tomorrow. It led to the National Party victory in 1948 and the formal introduction of apartheid. But before we go and look at this more, as I say, well-known and well-covered period in South African history, let's just stop and pause and acknowledge the role of those early colonials in setting up this racial division. Because certainly Cecil Rhodes, as has been found out, was as responsible as Verwoerd, someone in the National Party, because they set the scene, and the English were as responsible for that, for allowing these teams to play on separate fields, to have a separate administration, for banning people of colour from opposing teams to come to this country. This was all before apartheid. But in 1948, of course, it was formalised. It predated the National Party for the reasons I mentioned. Throughout its history, race has determined identity and allocation of resources in South Africa since the days of colonisation. When the National Party came to power, they gave existing policies a new name, apartheid, and tightened those policies with new laws. There was never specific legislation prohibiting racially integrated sport. Instead, it was left to old age customs. People had always played on separate pitches, played with people of their own colour, so that continued. And I think that's where if you can say, the success of apartheid came from. Because it wasn't new. It wasn't something just introduced in 1948. And of course, it was all about denying sporting opportunities. But this is where I'm going to step in, and often at a conference or whatever, then South Africa is held as something unique. South Africa wasn't unique during this time. What was happening in the United States? What was happening in the UK? South Africa was not alone in sports racism. Recent coverage of the Negro Leagues in baseball in America. But they didn't have formal laws that govern separation in sport. America was left to old age custom. Of course, the civil rights movement in the South. People not being able to go in certain restaurants, travel on buses. It was left to old age custom, and the fact that's how it always was. We know football is blighted by racism. Certain countries today have a massive problem. As I say to my students often, I mean, they weren't born in the 70s and 80s, but in the 70s and 80s, in fact, That was when the first black players were representing England and more actually playing professional leagues. And these pioneers in England, this so-called place of equality, only a few years ago, in my lifetime, were having bananas thrown on the pitch on a daily basis, every time they played. So South Africa wasn't unique. What it was unique in was creating official laws based on racial separation. And I think that's got to be made clear every time, because time and time again I see South Africa shown as the racist, the most racist country in the world, or whatever. Other countries have been blighted by this and continue to do so. And that's not to defend it, it's just to say we've got to look at it as a whole. These wonderful pictures I found on the internet recently, these show rugby being played at a very high level amongst, obviously, non-white population groups. Not only being played, as we can see, to vast audiences, but organised in the same way. Leagues, probably underhand payments, probably players paying to be played, or playing for payment, but more than that, the passion and the skill with which these players played was on a par with white players, I'm sure, but it was kept separate, and that's the key. So we now know, thankfully, that historians from these groups, as well as other people, are now recording a separate history, or almost a parallel history to what we know about the Springboks and rugby in this country, thankfully. Okay, we all know this man here, but 1950 was certainly a time when everything became entrenched. The National Party enacted the Group Areas Act, and that separated geographic areas. Rugby was legally and physically divided along racial boundaries because of that. Rugby was getting affected by the racial politics in this country because it was a massive part of life. It couldn't be ignored. In 1953, the Reservation of Separate Amenities Act led to a segregation of public areas in South Africa, including rugby pitches. It wasn't specified, but of course, if you talk about public areas, arguably one of the most important public areas were recreation spaces, our rugby pitches. A split in the South African Coloured Rugby Board causes the Western Province League to form the South African Rugby Football Federation under a chap called Charles Lauriston. So there were even splits within the coloured factions as well, because the tensions of this political pressure were starting to tell. But they're quite significant, and I'll talk about those in a minute, that group. Now, by 1960s, and again, I'm jumping ahead, it's hard to summarise this, but there was the formation of the South African Non-Racial Olympic Committee. The group calls for the boycott of South Africa from the 1964 Olympics. And I think the 60s was significant, because now those opposed to apartheid could see they could use sport as a tool with which to end this regime. Of course, the one thing that all South Africans got in common is they are sport fans. And a bit like our Australians, they want to be good at sport. And to be good at sport, you need competition. So it's a bit like that annoying kid in the playground. He often owns the ball, but if you take the ball away, he can't play anymore. And that was the idea. Let's try to remove competition from the South Africans who are behind apartheid, and perhaps they may change their ways. So as early as 1964, there was a call to boycott South Africa from the Olympic Games. The South African Coloured Rugby Board becomes SARU. You've probably heard of the South African Rugby Union in '66. So the 60s was starting to establish a movement against apartheid through sport. Then, in '67, New Zealand cancelled a tour because what this man said. Revert announced that it was forbidding their team from coming because it included Maoris. Again, this old question would come up. Okay? And at the time, the English weren't a problem because they didn't contain players of colour. But the Maori question kept irritating the leaders of apartheid because this wonderful sport we call rugby was bringing to light that the rest of the world was operating slightly differently, on the surface anyway. How did the rest of the world react? Well, we know certainly there were protests in Britain and in rugby-playing nations, but New Zealand in particular, all black Maori issues, signed the protest petition. New Zealanders themselves, certainly more liberal New Zealanders, said rugby is not worth this. We've got to stop the tour going. And this is when the pressure started to escalate, especially during the 70s. And you've heard of this slogan, I'm sure. No normal sport in an abnormal society. Outside the White House in Washington, stop the racist South African rugby tour. Box go home. Wherever the Springboks went at this time, they faced protests. This international isolation, this idea of removing them from competition, And I say them, the rugby players, well, they weren't the architects of apartheid. These young men were the victims, perhaps, in many respects. But politics was thrust upon rugby, as it was in other areas of life in South Africa. So the 70s certainly intensified this idea of using boycotts against South Africa. Now, this idea of boycotts, it should be explored. Because there's two ways of thinking about it. If you want to change someone's behaviour, do you then isolate them, or perhaps do you keep them included with negotiations? A bit like we were talking about yesterday. There's two ways of thinking about it. We know that it was, at this time, sport was still being played in South Africa, and perhaps those who supported apartheid were using sport as an example of how this was a normal situation. But then sport became a way of changing that opinion. We know there were rebel tours that came down, and propaganda was used in defiance. Sport is separate from politics. We're told that all the time in the United Kingdom, by the way. Sport is never separate from politics, because sport involves power relations and it involves money. So therefore politics will be part of it. Those who were in favour of boycott said apartheid structured all social relations in South Africa, and as part of social relations, remember, sport reflects society, therefore you cannot remove sport from those social relations. However, those who were anti-boycott said sport is separate and different. Perhaps, even if you were anti-apartheid, you would say that sport would build bridges. Instead of isolating this group, why don't we play with them and work with them and persuade them? So there was still this debate about the legitimacy of boycotts. But Doug Booth, who's done a lot of studies on South African sport at that time, agrees that the sports boycott has particular legitimacy. It was non-violent and it worked. Perhaps it did. But certainly, in terms of violence, it was not. You didn't have to protest. It was the fact you removed competition from a group of people who certainly wanted to prove themselves elite in the game of rugby. In the 1970s, the National Party enacted the Bantu Homeland Citizen Act, which effectively removed South African citizenship, as we know, and required them to become citizens of that particular area. That would involve the way they spent their leisure time and where they spent their leisure time. So again, new laws were being brought in that was affecting rugby. And this is why I mentioned the South African Rugby Football Federation. They actually sent a team to the UK and Holland against the wishes of Saru, who believed that society should be normalised before sport was. So even the non-white population had disagreements. Some were saying, let's continue playing international matches, whereas others said, no, let's isolate even ourselves, because we need to show the rest of the world that the situation is not normal. The formation of the South African Council on Sport, a group aiming to establish non-racial sporting development. So South Africa, again, in the 1970s, was literally steps ahead of trying to form bodies that were against sport and race. Then we can see a slight change in attitude. The mid to late 70s, the National Party announced that multinationalism in sport should be extended down to the club level. So they allowed blacks to participate in the same sporting organisations, pending special permission. But remember, the culture of this country was so entrenched with people playing in their own ethnic groups. Often, this wasn't even challenged. But it was piecemeal to the rest of the world, of course. New Zealand again, so important, that relationship between the All Blacks and the Springboks, attracts international condemnation, with 28 countries boycotting the 1976 Olympic Games because the New Zealand tour of South Africa went ahead. So now the Olympics are being affected by this, and rugby is affecting that. This is the team that came down, of course, the All Black tour team there, you can see, not a Maori face amongst them. So the politics of New Zealand was now being called into question. How important is the game of rugby in New Zealand? On the same level as South Africa. So they're being torn apart by this idea. They want to play the Springboks and vice versa. But of course it was bringing big trouble at home. In 77, international isolation intensifies. That's when the Gleneagles Agreement was brought in. Countries were discouraged formally with having any sporting contact with South Africa. The French blocked a planned tour in 1979. In 81, look at this. The South African Rugby Football Board had white players. The Saru were non-racial mixed. SARA, Black African, and SARF, South African Rugby Football Federation, had colour players. In 1981, as recent as that, you had 4 governing bodies in this country representing our wonderful game of rugby based upon the colour of its members. In 81. Then the big one happened. I think the significant tour was 1981. The Springboks toured New Zealand in defiance of the Glen Eagles agreement. Rugby is bigger than this, it's nothing to do with politics. That was the argument. The second match between the Springboks and the All Blacks was cancelled because of hundreds of protesters occupying the pitch. It was bringing the kind of publicity that the National Party government didn't want. Box go home, of course. There was the incident of flour being chucked on the pitch, things being chucked on the pitch for the games not to continue. And this is something we can talk about for days and days, of course. But I think 81 was perhaps the final straw. The two big giants came together, and now physically the games were being stopped because of the wider politics, or what was happening beyond the trial. But something else happened in 1981. Something else happened that was significant. This man emerged. Errol Tobias. He becomes the first non-white player to win a Springbok cap, Alan, against Ireland here at Newlands, before the tour. He went away on that 81 tour. So, where arguably, now, I put a post up about him on Facebook recently. It's incredible the admiration that came in, but from rugby people who said he was an incredible talent. He was one of those gifted guys that could have played any sport. Now, whether he was selected to try to placate tensions for the 81 tour, maybe some of it, we want to be cynical. But he was fed to the lions because he was the first man up. And if we look at that team, he stands out, doesn't he? Mm-hmm. He stands out. Here's Nick Mallett, looking rather young in those days, at the back. The shape of rugby players has certainly changed in recent years, that's for sure. If you look at, I love these old teams during the 70s and 80s. But let's get back. Errol Tobias gained 6 caps, 22 test points between 81 and 84. Should have played a lot more, according to a lot of sources. He said, I decided I was going to show South African people that all men are born equal. I wanted to show them that colour doesn't matter. If you've got the skills, then you should play for your country. My goal was to show the country and the rest of the world that we had black players who are equally as good, if not better than the whites, and that if you're good enough, you should play. So, of course, he's acknowledging the colour of his skin. He's talking about the relationship between white and black, but he was the first black player. Of course, we think of Chester Williams, and later on, this man was a pioneer. He was representative of the majority of South Africans for the first time in a Springbok shirt.
Who was the captain then?
You tell me.
You won Saturday. You won Saturday.
Thank you.
Struggle. Yes. Yes, yes.
They all look like your father, don't they, in those days? They look so much older. I think it's wonderful.
Some talent.
No. Wonderful
yes,
talent.
Yes.
Now we're moving on. We're going to jump to the 90s, the 80s to the 90s, because if we talk about talent, and I think the tragedy of any sportsman or woman born in that era was the competition that was robbed of them, the experience. And I think it's an absolute, we're talking about Bruce Van Bell and people like that. I mean, anybody who's played at the top level, incredible talents, because of the politics of this country, they couldn't play for the country as often as they should have done. If we look at that, during that period, 84 to 92, South Africa were banned by the International Rugby Board as a result of the nation's politics. During that time, South Africa played just 10 test matches, missing out on 2 World Cups and the proposed British Lions tour of 86. The British, of course, would try to keep the relations going. Not on the... I think there was a lot of hypocrisy, certainly during Maggie Thatcher's time, in terms of the relations. We oppose apartheid, but we can continue trading and sending our teams down there. So there was hypocrisy in terms of Britain, I'm sure. That's why New Zealand's often looked at it, because it was more obvious. But that is the stat. I mean, South Africans were robbed of top-level sporting competition in all sports, especially rugby. So eventually, something had to give. And then we had Darnie Craven, Louis Late of the South African Rugby Board, Abraham Patel and Thabo Mbeki of the non-racial South African Rugby Union. And Mbeki involved in rugby at that stage, certainly the non-racial governance of it. Steve Schwette and Alfred, how do you say that? Nzo, of the ANC meet to discuss the formation of a single non-racial body. And that was the key. In 88, they were talking about bringing rugby together under one governing body. And that was the key, because we know what was happening in 88. The National Party was starting to talk about the release of Nelson Mandela. They were starting to look forward in terms of what was going to be the end game in this apartheid. Many people think sport played a central role in the end of apartheid. We could overstate it, but I'm sure Nelson Mandela would agree that sport was significant in what happened next. So in 1992, on the 23rd of March, the South